our second course.
I don't like the motivation either.
How acceptable is the use of GM technology to generate, and this is a good Australian one, especially for us, particularly also in South Australia, drought-tolerant wheat? So let's just vote on that one first up. Interesting result there. So, well, let's perhaps throw to you, Alan. Why do you think that one came up like that?
Well, I think it goes to this question about, search for the technological fix, really, and I think that, whether or not it's, gene testing for genetic disorders, the applications for many genetic tests are very limited at the moment. And I think that the question I would want to know is, do people really know what the risks are? And with any new technology, there's uncertainties. And I think that one of the things about science is trying to control uncertainty. And whenever there is an uncertainty, is trying to transform it into a risk. Because if you transform something that's an uncertainty, with any genetic modification, there's an uncertainty about what the long-term implications would be. If you transform it into a risk, then it's calculable and it's governable. And policymakers and scientists all the time want to turn something into a risk. And this language of risk absolutely dominates everything. So I'd like to have a conversation about the uncertainties associated with that. I'm bowing away from technological fix to actually trying to understand why people would respond that way. And it's this search, for the technological fix.
Craig?
Yeah, we've asked this question in a lot of surveys we've done. I'll show you something very interesting. Hands up everyone in the room who would happily eat GM bread. Now, if we did a head count, we'll see how that compares with this one, because we know generally more people will say, yes, drought-resistant wheat, that's a beauty. I can see the social benefit from that. But when it's in front of you, it's a GM bread, oh, hang on, it diminishes. It drops down about 50, 60%. So there is a discord between crops and food in people's minds. No surprise, we've never been at a time we're so urbanised, and most people's perception of food has come from supermarkets, not from growers.
Yes, sorry, we've got a lady there.
Hi, I just think with the question it's really vague. So yes, I'd like drought-tolerant wheat, but what are we using? Are we using a fish DNA to make that? Or are we using another plant? I mean, my answer would change depending on what you say.
Yeah, that's a fair comment.
So you fell in the unsure area, did you, when you voted?
Because
yes.
I don't really know
Not
where
enough
we're going
information.
With it. Yeah.
All right. Well, Mark Tester, you've worked in these areas. What are you using to create this drought-tolerant wheat? Does it exist?
Drought-tolerant wheat?
No, GM. I heard something on the news the other day saying that there was concerns that the GM technology was already going to be talked about in trials in South Australia for, I think it was drought-tolerant wheat, wasn't it?
Yes. There are a few organisations in Australia now. There's about 3 different organisations in Australia now who are doing field trials to test whether the transgenic plants that they've made will have increased drought tolerance. To answer your question, to my knowledge, they're all plant genes in plants, and certainly in our organisation, they're all wheat genes in wheat, and that may give some level of comfort. Whether they're actually drought tolerant or not, we've still got to test that over a few years.
Can you just explain that for me too? Because when you were talking before, you're talking about GM technology within plants, but are you saying you take a drought-tolerant wheat, take that gene out of that drought-tolerant wheat, and then put it into another one that produces a lot of grains to produce good drought-tolerant wheat? Is that what you're talking about? Or is it you take the gene of a cactus plant or something and put it into the wheat plant?
No, we don't take cactus. It's easy to make cacti. That's no help to the Australian farmer.
No, but you're using whatever...
There are different strategy. You're asking how to discover the gene. I can give you a whole lecture, I won't.
Yeah.
One way is to look for genes that are different in a plant that's more able to keep growing in low water versus in plants that peg out really quickly. That's one way to do it. These particular field trials at the moment are mainly taken by discovering genes from parts of plants that activate these genes when they dry down, like in a developing grain that's up in the air and it dries out as the grain's developing and filling the starch. It's got to keep lots of metabolism going. So there are genes activated to help protect that grain during its development. And it's those sorts of genes, for example, that are being discovered and then turned on in the body of the plant rather than just.
So it could even be within the same plant that you're developing.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, well that's.
They're wheat genes in wheat. Yeah.
Wheat genes in wheat. Okay.
And they've just been turned on at a different way at a different time.
Can I just refer to the lady's question there about the fish DNA in the wheat? Do you know what all the cans, or what's in the cans of food you eat exactly? I mean, what we do is we rely on ANSFA, which is Australia New Zealand Food Safety Authority, to make sure that to make sure that most of the public would trust what we're eating. Again, vaccines and therapeutic goods. There are authorities that are looking after us, and in this field there must also be authorities that are trying to look after us. Now, the public may not always necessarily trust those authorities. In fact, there's
well,
probably...
that's the joke, because the people say, trust me, I'm from the government.
Over time, politicians and policemen and everyone in society we're becoming less trusting of these people. But at the end of the day, there are bodies in place that are looking after these issues for us, and that we don't necessarily have to worry if there's fish DNA in the... It's as long as they've shown that it's safe and they do testing for that. So perhaps someone could explain what the whole process is in terms of the testing regime.
I'd love to have a chance to respond.
Scott, you want to respond to the ladies?
Yeah, and it comes back to your question as well. And there's an assumption when we throw these questions up that the safety's fine, the regulators approved it, and we're all comfortable with that process. And I'm not, and I know a lot of you are not comfortable with the process of regulation. The process in North America is a little bit different to in Australia, where it's almost a self-regulatory process there, where they sign a guarantee to the federal government in North America that the product is safe to use. In Australia, they do have to apply to our regulator. They submit an application with about a pallet load of boxes of data, and we have scientists who read through that data. That data, most of the time, not always, is unpublished. Most of the time is not peer-reviewed. And most of the feeding trials, not all, are what I would call very short-term. They're a matter of 3, 6, 8 weeks. And looking at really whether there's acute, gross problems with the product, whether the chickens or the pigs die quickly or have some, they don't look really very deeply into that. So from my perspective, and Judy Carmen's not here tonight, I think she's in the UK, but she's well known to you South Australians as an epidemiologist. She worked for the South Australian government, gives a very good presentation around the dangers of genetically modified foods, and there is some evidence of harm that has emerged in a very small number of peer-reviewed studies. The reality is that taxpayers around the world are not funding virtually any studies looking into this. There's a Professor Seralini in France, is one of the few that's researching it. Judy Carmen is doing some work funded out of the previous Labor government in Western Australia. The Austrian government's done a small study. There's a very, very tiny amount of research that is looking at long-term feeding trials. So when you ask me that question, I think, well, it's great. I mean, we're in Australia. Look at what's going on. It's not raining, except it is where I'm coming from. It hasn't stopped raining at Daylesford for the last 3 months. But prior to that, it didn't rain for 10 years. And so everyone in Australia would love to see drought-tolerant wheat. But we can achieve all of these results through other methodologies. We haven't talked tonight about marker-assisted breeding, and that's where this debate is complex. We can't just... These are Dorothy Dix's. Hello? No-brainer questions. Yeah, of course, I'll probably vote for that one too.
I'd like to just... you've talked a lot there about some issues that probably need to be raised better in the media. I mean, we've got Claire Petty tonight along from the media. Where's Claire? Yeah, Claire. Now, Claire, what's your view about... I mean, do you think people are properly informed? We heard all these issues before, like drought-tolerant wheat. I mean, would the public accept that? How would you write that story in the paper?
I have written that story in the paper, and I can probably pull it out of my bag and have a look at how it went in. I think people are starting to take a case-by-case view in the way that Mark Tester is suggesting that we ought to. That people want to have a think about, well, what's in it for me, I think is probably the number one question for our readers. So they are appreciating the fact that Australia's has been in the grip of drought for the best part of the last decade, and drought-tolerant wheat sounds like a reasonably good idea, but they might be a bit concerned about if there are any health impacts at all. But if it sounds like a plant gene, even a wheat gene into a wheat, then that sounds all right. I think people might like or be quite ready to consider something that sounds like it's more nutritious or better for them, or got some amazing health benefits as well, rather than some of the things people are mostly scared about are things that sound like they're not a good idea.
All right.
A lot of the early GM stuff was
Now we've got Jason Eglinton here too as a plant breeder. Jason, would you like to just explain? Are you doing anything that people should be frightened of?
Not professionally.
How much red have you had?
No, look, I guess I should explain that the breeding program that I'm responsible for is a conventional breeding program, and if you say that in the year 2010, that means marker-assisted selection. That means a whole raft of biotechnology separate to GM and the issues around that. So, and
could you get a drought-tolerant wheat without, just a normal way? I mean, would you be able to do that?
Conventional plant breeding in Australia has driven a huge amount of growth in our agricultural industries. Basically, we're, I think, and David might comment, but sitting at a long-term average of 3% per annum growth in total factor productivity in the cropping sector across the nation, and probably between 1 and 1.5% of that might be coming from plant breeding and the related development of new varieties, and that's all conventional plant breeding, world's best practice, marker-assisted selection and the like. But the reality is there are plateaus, and we're already concerned that we're starting to see perhaps some horizons on that growth rate. And if we go back to the original comments at the top, of course our global requirements for food are growing at greater than 3% per annum, of course. So there's a gap. And I guess from my point of view as a professional plant breeder, I don't see how we address that gap using the techniques that we're using at the moment.
Let's go back and perhaps go back to our vote again. Marginal.